This is the podcast of the Nova Center on Business, Human Rights, and the Environment. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. Today, our guest is Professor Eduardo Saad-Diniz. Eduardo, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, Julia. Thanks a lot for the so kind invitation to join that podcast from the Business and Human Rights Working Group from the Nova Lisboa School in Portugal. Well, I'm Eduardo Saad-Diniz. I teach criminology at the University of São Paulo, at the Ribeirão Preto Law School, both at the Ribeirão Preto Law School and Latin American Studies program. I'm very delighted to be here with you guys today. Thanks a lot for being so kind with my broken English, for accepting my broken English, especially to Professor Athina Sachoulidou, for it's a pleasure to receive your feedback on that working paper I submitted to you, the Corporate Transitional Justice working paper. And also thanks to Margarida and Alice for being so kind in giving us support today.
Okay, so we will start with some general questions to present the context of Brazil. And I would like to know from you that corporate criminal law seems to be neglected in Brazil. Why is it so? Do you think there is room for alternatives?
Oh, Julia, that's a great question, right? We are supposed to start a good podcast. We usually need to have a why, right? And then we usually need to help the audience to take the next step. So are there any alternatives? So they're very challenging questions. I'm not sure that I have the answer for all of them. I've been researching that why question in the last 10 years, at least. And I have many ideas and impressions about that that I would like to share with you, and then to hear your opinion about this. Especially among us in Brazil, the continental European tradition is very important. It's very important. The influence is something that we shouldn't simply dismiss, right? And according to that tradition, the idea of a societas delinquere non potes, the fact that corporations can't act, it's still very predominant in the field. There are many scholars that are still reproducing that kind of metaphysical denial of the fact that corporations can act. It means we still face a lot of difficulties to recognize a corporate personhood. But it's only the first theoretical standpoint. There are many other reasons. I personally am engaged, as you know, to develop a kind of economic history of corporate criminal liability among us. It's not something easy. I do that all by myself. I do that with the many limitations that we face, infrastructural limitations that we face here. But this is what we have, to begin with. We simply don't know how to better understand the impact of criminal sanctions in the market. It's something very difficult to really comprehend, right? So it's not a simple question of saying, oh, let's start by a tremendous renew of our criminal policies. Let's simply start attributing liability to corporations. It's not simply like that. The criminal justice system, as we know, replicates the selectiveness also when we talk about crimes of the powerful, also when we talk about corporate crime. So we can give, by means of the formal social control, a powerful instrument for the most powerful people. So it's not simple to say that if we do tomorrow, if we expand the idea of corporate criminal liability, that we'll be achieving a better corporate criminal justice, so to say. And another argument is the fact that our communities, local communities, are extremely vulnerable, to the interactions with corporations. I tried to come up with the idea of community dependence as a knowledge gap when we talk about collateral damages of attributing corporate criminal liability. It's not simple the fact that the employees would be damaged, their families or consumers. It's the fact that those who are being systematically victimized by corporations, they are highly dependent on them. In victimological terms, the victims turns dependent to their offenders, right? So if we start simply attributing criminal liability to corporations, we are also double jeopardizing local communities. So we need much more sophisticated approaches to overcome that idea. And the last one, the third, to come up with some structure, right, in the argument and in the talk, the third argument would be about the fact that we are still facing a tremendous level of complicity, of corporate complicity with authoritarian dynamics among us. And now I'm talking about the Brazilian context. We have no moral voice to face authoritarian dynamics among us, because our corporations, they are not doing that in a sufficient manner. They are not reckoning with their complicity in the past, with our military dictatorship from 64 to 85 in the last century. They didn't recognize their role on financing that authoritarian regime. So how and why they are talking about right now? They're talking about business ethics. They have their integrity guides. They do their training programs. They do their integrity pacts, etc., but without a democratic commitment. So this is something very challenging to that first reaction to the question of why we are neglecting corporate criminal liability.
So at the same time that it seems to be some kind of neglecting corporate criminal law in Brazil, we are watching the rise of many enforcement initiatives, such as the famous car wash, another one called weak meat, or even cases such as Brumadinho and Mariana, which are real tragedies, social and environmental tragedies. What do you think that is wrong with these operations?
Oh, this is another challenging question. Thanks a lot for that. Yes, I've been criticizing all those operations, but not in a way that you can say, "Oh my God, Eduardo is against corporations. Oh my God, Eduardo is an anti-corporate guy." Not like that, please. So please understand what I'm trying to say. We need to use corporate resources to restore our societies. We need to use corporate resources to reshape the way that we are dealing with those social environmental tragedies, okay? But yes, when we look at those social environmental tragedies, we are talking about the fact that those giant mining companies, they have been exploiting the environment since, I don't know, 7, 8 decades by means of systematically building those dams, right, at the lowest cost possible. Why do they do that? Their annual revenue is, I don't know, 50, 60 billion US dollars per year. Why are they so morally indifferent to the possible consequences of their decision-making processes, right? But now that when we talk about corporate criminal liability, it's important to say in Brazil, we talk only about environmental offenses. It's very limited, restricted to those behaviors. The criminal justice system simply doesn't have the tools to face the violent behavior that systematically builds those dams. What we do instead of it, we simply indict some of the engineers of high-ranked CEOs that are in the case. All initiatives, they are highly focused on individual accountability. we are doing nothing concerning to the corporations. So why should those corporations find a social motivation to cooperate? If we look at their social and environment indicators, if we look at their results on that field, if we look at their global report initiatives reports, for instance, we can't simply, or it's very generic to say, but there is no substantial change in their behavior, or at least in their governance structures, or at least in their concerns related to environmental offenses. That are right now about 85 dams constructed with the same risky level. And well, we are talking about business and human rights. We can simply neglect the fact that those giant mining companies in the global south, I mean here Africa and America, they are feeding the Chinese demand regardless a minimum of safety in what they are doing. We should be facing their practices. The same thing concerning to the Petrobras case or to the Odebrecht case, as it is internationally known. Well, if I'm not wrong, to the best of my knowledge, there are 209 agreements with our criminal justice system. But what are the results? If we look at the assets that we recovered, they are not meaningful, simply don't represent a minimum of justice in those cases. We don't have a meaningful knowledge concerning to the damage, the extension of harm, who and how is being harmed. So how we should be talking about asset recovery if we are suffering and the lack of knowledge concerning to harm? What does it mean to talk about public interest in those agreements? They mean nothing if we look, as we did here in Brazil, if we look at the property of those who asked for the agreements, they are almost uninjured, unbroken, right? So this is something that truly compromises how the prosecutors are dealing with the case. Same thing with the Volkswagen case, very recent Volkswagen case among us. If we look at the agreement, for instance, we are going to see at their second considerando, they say expressly, well, I'm part of the case of all those cases, right? Please don't feel that I am totally against corporations. It's not the case. I'm simply observing the case, observing how we are reducing the system, the justice system, to a system of pleas. When Volkswagen did the agreement, the second considerandum says, without recognizing any liability of the legal entity, its directors, employees, we are going to start talking about transitional justice in restorative sense. What does it mean? We don't know who and how is being victimized. We don't know what kind of behavior is the behavior that is under, that we can conceive as being a corporate complicity case. We don't know what exactly we should be restoring. So that fact that we are highly focused on individual accountability from one side, and from the other hand, that we are reducing our justice system to a system of pleas, that truly, Julia, that truly compromises what we are talking about, corporate criminal liability.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. It's a lot of information, a lot to process, but it has been amazing. Now I'm going to give the floor to Athina.
Thank you very much. Julia, my name is Athina Sachoulidou. I'm an assistant professor at the Nova School of Law, and being a scholar specialized in corporate and financial criminal law, I was highly interested to what Eduardo was explaining to us so far with regard to the Brazilian context, the Brazilian approach to corporate crime at first place and corporate criminal liability at second place, despite the fact that I'm not a huge fan of the term corporate criminal liability. I always tend to prefer using the term corporate liability ex crimine, but this is more of a piece of information regarding my doctrinal approach to the topic. And I can already say that I totally agree that we have made a lot of effort to understand these concepts doctrinally without having the proper empirical basis. And if I understood, this is what Eduardo was trying to say at the very end. So that said, and having the intention to comment your very recent work titled The Idea of Corporate Transitional Justice, Paths to Corporate Criminology in Brazil, a great title, by the way, I was wondering which are, on your opinion, the most important takeaways, the most important lessons to be learned from the global south when it comes to corporate criminology. So if we look towards the Brazil, what can we learn when it comes to corporate crime?
Wow. Thanks a lot, Tina, for being so kind in your comments, for this tough question on the takeaways. The first thing, according to my opinion, is the fact that we didn't learn anything concerning to the recent history of corporate scandals. I had an extraordinary opportunity to work in US under Professor William Alfer's supervision. He was very generous with me at the time when he received me at the University of Pennsylvania. And I took that lesson from him. The fact that he was personally saying that in US, they didn't learn from their 30, 20 years of scientific evidence in that field, especially concerning to the fact that individual accountability doesn't have a minimum deterrent effect, and the fact that we need much more sophisticated, smarter ways of doing the social control of business. And if they are saying so, what can I say about Brazil is the fact that we didn't learn from their unlearned lessons, right? There is also a tremendous book from a professor at the Duke University, Professor Brendan Garrett. It's called Too Big to Jail. It's a classic in the field. And he says that the US authorities, they are losing the battle against the giant corporations. It's kind of battle, David versus Goliath, right? And then he says US versus Goliath. As a brilliant Brazilian scholar, what I did, I just wrote a paper called Brazil versus Goliath. And then I said, if they are losing the battle, can't you simply imagine what are we doing here? So we are spending a tremendous amount of resources in our criminal justice system with that car wash operation, with extraordinary impacts in our neighbors in Latin America, but also in Africa. And where are the results? So why are we doing so many efforts on that way? So we usually compare what we done in Brazil with the Manipuliti operation in Italy, right? Our authorities, they said that we were trying to apply a kind of Manipuliti among us in Brazil. But those authorities, if you look at what they wrote in their papers, they usually said, oh, the problem with Manipuliti was the fact that there was no meaningful change concerning to the Italian market, and also there was no meaningful change concerning to a more ethical political climate. They faced Berlusconi at the end, right? So what are we doing? We're simply replicating international mistakes here among us. And also another lesson that we need to learn actually is the fact that we need better data. We need much more investment in our scientific institutions. And I'm not talking about defending myself, defending the fact that I need much more investment to do my own research. It's not like that. So trying to be serious, we need better data to have better analytics based on evidence so that we can rebuild a corporate criminology in a shape or in a Brazilian matrix. But we usually do the opposite. We have some ideas, we dispute with those ideas, especially among us, the criminal lawyers. Wow, they make tremendous speech, they are very beautiful speech. They usually start with Camões and Fernando Pessoa, and then we end here talking about with Brazilian songs, etc. It's very beautiful to hear them, but what are we doing in a meaningful way to reveal the fact that our criminal justice system is simply saying no to the most poor people, to the poorest people in the country? Brazil has about 850,000 people in jail right now with a very similar characteristics. They are poor, young, Black people. At the same time, we are doing almost nothing concerning to our corporations. Oh, but we can talk about the administrative sanctions. Let us talk about administrative sanctions. We can talk about another lesson that we didn't learn. If we talk about administrative sanctions in such a continental country like Brazil, Brazil is a huge country. We have very specific alignments in each single state, right? Based upon which those institutions are built. So we can simply take the administrative system as a harmonic whole of things, you know? They are very contradictory. They have many specificities that we simply neglect. And we also neglecting the fact that this administrative structure is almost the same structure that was put in practice during the military dictatorship times. Another lesson that we should be learning.
Thank you very much, Eduardo, for this great insight into the Brazilian reality, one might say. And actually, I will dare to say that this is not that Brazilian after all. I think that this is more of a general trend of first regulating, or even worse, penalizing, neglecting the ultima ratio function of criminal law, using it in a symbolical way. And then we seek to understand the phenomenon that we wanted to combat at the first place. And yeah, if I might add anything, it's not about better data, it's about data itself. This is what we are lacking.
Yes. Yes.
In your paper, there was a very interesting idea called corporate transition justice. So I would like to ask you if you could elaborate a bit more on that idea, and what will be the implications of such a concept for corporate liability discriminate itself? So what will be the impact on the way that we prosecute and punish corporate crime?
Well, I'll try to be brief, Athina, because I have so many stories to tell about that concept. Well, if we look at the Brazilian recent history, we'll be seeing that there is a lot of similarities between the business network that supported the dictatorship and the business network that is right now at the center of those enforcement operations and at the center of the new emerging leadership concerning related to business integrity among us in the country. It's the same thing. It's almost the same actors. So it's unbelievable to observe that historic continuum during that time. What was in the past a direct or indirect or silent complicity with the dictatorship is right now something very similar to a complicity with authoritarian dynamics in the country. But there is nobody in the country who can raise the moral voice against the rise of such authoritarian dynamics. Why? Because they never opened their archives, recognizing their responsibility with the past complicity with atrocities. That's a very delicate question that, well, I think that he wants to know how I came out with that idea, right? 6 years ago, I was at the university, and then I opened the newspapers, and then I saw that a very powerful financial institution in the country published a calendar where the day 21st of March was celebrated. What happened that day 50 years ago, or 56 years ago right now? The military putsch in the country. Why should a bank should celebrate 50 years of the military dictatorship? And another much more delicate question, maybe it's too personal for me, but why should I, as a professor of a state-owned university, why should I accept such a thing? I simply should. I felt myself truly obligated to do something. You know, it's a moral obligation that we have as professor from state-owned universities, right? Later then, I realized that there was an investigation against Volkswagen Brazil because of their complicity. It was at the same year, 2014, right? And I tried to have access to the trial, you know, it's my obligation. I'm here for that. And I want to see what exactly, well, as Julia asked it before, what are the alternatives? I don't know what are the alternatives. They need to show me what are the alternatives. I need to think about what they're doing, right? And exactly at the same time, we started talking about impeachment in the country, right? I don't want to make a political speech here, okay? You would never realize exactly who I am supporting, okay? But looking at the facts, okay? When we look at the social groups supporting the impeachment, you would see the same federation of industries supporting the social movements. But if you look at that federation of industries, they were at the center of the business network that supported the regime, the military regime. And right now, they are at the front again. But they are not at the front again only right now. They were at the front during the impeachment of Collor. They supported Fernando Henrique Cardoso. They supported Lula da Silva. They are ruling the game since 6, 7 decades. And they are ruling that game at the same time they are teaching me what should I be talking about business integrity. I simply can't accept it, if you understand.
I can perfectly see the point. I'm thinking all this time about this argument about cultural identity of corporations.
Oh, yes.
It should be assessed while we examine their current liability about crimes that have recently been committed.
I'm not sure if you know the Rede Globo is a powerful corporations in the telecommunications, but I'm quite sure that Julia and Margarida, they do. I'm quite sure that they look at the soap operas that Globo did, etc. I am exactly the same person that look at the soap operas. But before the soap operas, we have the newspapers, right? And I have nothing to do in my life. And then I started looking at the newspapers. And there was a fascinating interview with a candidate to the presidential elections in 2018, right? His name is Jair Bolsonaro. He's now our current president. Jair Bolsonaro made possible for me to talk about corporate transitional justice. I owe that to him, right? During the interview, the progressive journalists, they started talking, oh, you were in favor of torture. Oh, you are making so many compliments to that military that tortured the ex-president Dilma Rousseff, etc. Yes, thanks a lot for that tremendous opportunity to express my own opinion and to share my political agenda with you all guys. Because I didn't, or I'm not alone on this. You are with me. And then he started talking about the complicity of that corporation with the military regime. And what they did concerning to the transitional justice stuff, they simply made a note in a newspaper, a short note in 2003. Is that enough? I am the third biggest telecommunication corporation in the planet. And is that enough? Is that a solution for, or are you accepting that as an excuse? Are we accepting that as a business apology? What does it mean for me? And I think that for the entire idea of corporate transitional justice, the fact that in the private sector, there is nobody that can face or that has at least moral authority to face the rise of authoritarian dynamics among us. We need transitions.
And speaking of transition of the past, you also mentioned in your paper that, well, there wasn't a lot of attention paid to the involvement of corporations in crimes against humanity. Yes. One might also add that, of course, corporate liability is blatantly missing from the Rome Statute as well. And there is currently a debate about reassessing the inclusion of corporate liability in the light of penalizing ecocide, so the wrongful behavior of corporations when it comes to the environmental impact. What is your personal explanation for that? Why we are facing such a gap, if there is a gap?
Oh, fascinating, Athina. You remind me of Professor Laufer, my supervisor in the US. He always wants me to come up with solutions. And I usually say, me, everything I should be, I should be answering to anything. You made the three most challenging questions in that field. Fascinating. Thanks a lot. The first one, why we are simply, the history neglected the role of corporations in transitional justice. There are some very relevant studies on that. One of them was published in the US by Leora Bilski. It's called, oh, it's here with me, Holocaust, Corporations in the Law. I learned a lot from that book, fascinating book, where she explains the fact that when we started talking about transitions, it would be seen as a mistake, as a strategic mistake, if they started talking about corporations, just at the beginning, right? We need first to recognize that in the past, there was a regime that was accomplished with atrocities. That is the first step, unless we would be neutralizing or we would be making it impossible to advance. Then we'll start talking about the unions. Then we'll start about, we would start talking about victims, people that disappeared, torture, and then diversity, gender, racial issues. And now we are at the time, at the period in the history that we should be facing the private sector, that we should be facing the role of corporations. And I'm quite sure if I can make a prognosis or I don't know, it's too much futurism, but we should be taking the church as well. There will be, it won't take so long until we should be talking about transitional justice in the religious field, right? But right now, the world is in need of alternatives, of alternative solutions to face not only the pandemics, but also the climate change. That's why we are talking about ecocide right now. That's why we need, or we do that now, or maybe it's too late to face corporations for the irreversible effects of their wrongdoing. We should be doing that now. Maybe we won't have an opportunity for the next generation to be talking about that. But when I talk about ecocide, wow, and then you were touching my heart because in the last weekend, I gave up to publish a paper on genocide. I was a little bit afraid of the fact that being a public employee of criticizing my boss, right? Last weekend, I just gave up to publish a paper on genocide. I was suggesting that if we don't recognize as being a crime the fact that we lost at least 5,000 local indigenous communities in a very deliberated omission of the state, because where they live, we have a convergence of offenses. New slavery, deforestation, because they need that land for the agribusiness in Brazil, right? So it's not the fact that they selected those indigenous, but there are some official communications where the representatives say, where they say they are all almost like us. Os índios são quase como nós. São quase tão seres humanos como nós, right? If we are not, and then the International Criminal Court, well, they simply archived the indictments, right? And if we are not recognizing such behavior as a socially undesirable behavior, what kind of message we are addressing? We are addressing the fact that we are normalizing that we can simply select some people, that we can, lives that we can destroy, and then we are accepting, we are normalizing a kind of soft genocide. Soft genocide is allowed. So maybe you can understand why I gave up to publish my paper. But then, if we have such difficulties for the imputation of liability into the genocide, well, we can guess how hard it would be to talk about ecocide. Well, and then I'm sorry, I don't want to be the only one that is talking, but you also asked about the Rome statute, right? I know some works, very decent researches in the political science field where they made some analytics concerning to that question, but I have a guess. We still don't know the regulatory impact of criminal sanctions. So it would be a strategic mistake to put everything at the Rome statute. If it is so hard to be implemented right now, could you imagine if we add the corporations at that level? So we should be engaged, at least the next generation should be engaged in filling that gap.
Totally agree with you with that regard, having also in mind the very recent French story with the French Swiss cement company and its involvement in terrorist attacks and terrorist financing in Syria. That's a very big step to take without being aware of the consequences, without being sure about the efficiency of the sanctions that we seek to impose. And that naturally leads me to my last question. So if it's not administrative law, as you said, at least when it comes to Brazil, this will be even more complicated. If corporate criminal liability is a very risky path to take, considering among other things also the very connection of criminal law with the human being. So what is left? Maybe I was thinking of, trying to restrike a balance between individual liability and corporate liability, whether criminal or of any other kind. So do you believe that we have done everything that will be possible in the field of individual criminal law before we start discussing concepts like corporate criminal liability?
Well, also a very challenging question, and also a question that demands a lot of research. I completely agree with you. Clearly, to begin with, we need better data on that. We need to know who, why, and how are being victimized by corporate harmful wrongdoing. Right? This is something that definitely is a need, and it's very hard to be consistent in that field. But if I may take a position in that, may be concerning to the extraordinary dynamics of a corporation, multinational corporations working in so many different jurisdictions. Maybe we are simply overcharging individuals when we talk about we should be focusing on individual liability. Also, and those are some of them are Professor Noffer's ideas as well. We could be risking to create a risk aversion ambience, and also we should be by targeting some individuals, some organizational structures. Maybe we should be simply manipulating investments as well. So this is something that we definitely clearly need more research on that. But my generic approach is the fact that we should be overcharging individuals. Maybe those individuals, they simply can't stop, right? Such extraordinary, the extraordinary dimensions of the organizations nowadays. If we look at the US Europe Private Shield, for instance, we can simply say that we can simply observe how Facebook reacted. They said, okay, so you are forbidding me to do something that I simply can't self-regulate anymore. It's far beyond my own capacity to deal with that information. Yes, so we should be developing that kind of unique expertise to understand the why and how corporations are cooperating to rebuild the world society. So that normative aspect is undeniable. We can simply refuse it.
Great. One might say that unless you decode human behavior, you cannot really decode corporate wrongdoing. Actually, we are talking about a batch of people of course, attaining very specific characteristics within the corporation, but at the very end, it's, a human who presses the button, right? Sometimes under great pressure, so we need to work towards both directions to find out what is the right balance between individual and corporate liability. It was a pleasure having you with us. It was a delight listening to you, giving us a great insight into the Brazilian reality. And this is something that is actually missing because those concepts are not to be discussed beyond the national context, even within the European Union, where we have the concept of corporate sanctions, but a great flexibility being provided to the national legislator with regard to the choice of the sanctions, actually for the very reasons that you have described to us. So it was great. There are no further questions on my side. I don't know if Julia has any other question, or we should give you the floor for a final comment if you wish.
Yes, Eduardo, final comments. I don't have any more questions. Thank you.
Well, I just want to finish by with my warm thanks, and also for you all being so kind with my broken English. It's not that easy to to understand and to continue the conversation when the guest when so many words are missing to the guest. So thanks a lot for being so kind, and especially to Julia. So we're partners in many challenging situations. The first one is or maybe the most relevant one was when we first met in Hong Kong, China, when we presented a panel at the Global Regulatory Governance Network. It was fascinating, with all those great scholars in the planet, and we were sending a real international message at that time. And the most impressive thing is the fact that even if we were there, we saw that those great scholars in the planet, they are also a little bit lost. We should be all in the globe. We should be all be engaged in developing alternatives for the planet, right? So thanks a lot for that opportunity.
Thank you very much, and hopefully see you next time in person in Lisbon.